webinar is hosted by JATA-NL, JATA-NL, or Jonge Atlantici in Dutch, for those of you who are not yet familiar with us, is an organization based in the Netherlands, which organizes all kinds of events and excursions for students and young professionals on the topic of transatlantic security. You can follow us online and on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, etc. And then finally, today's webinar is recorded and broadcasted by the Facebook NATO engagement group. You will also be able to find a recording of this session on our digital channels later. Having said all that, it's finally my honor to introduce today's guest, with whom I will be discussing the topic of disinformation and some other subjects as well. Ms. Carmen Romero, welcome.
Good afternoon, Hugo.
Good afternoon. So Carmen is the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy at NATO since October 2016. Before that, she spent 12 years with NATO as the Deputy Spokesperson and Head of Press and Media. And she was acting NATO spokesperson during the 2008 Russia-Georgia conflict. Before that, she also worked at the EFE news agency, covering all sorts of interesting topics. So to get today's webinar rolling, just a conversation starter, please tell me and the audience a bit more about yourself and also what is on your mind in the current societal and security situation from a NATO perspective.
Good afternoon, Hugo, and good afternoon to all the friends from the JATA Netherlands who are joining us today. And a special thanks for putting this webinar together and also for organizing every year the NATO night on the margins of the annual NATO anniversary. As we commemorate this 71st anniversary of NATO, who would have thought that we will all be facing this year a common invisible threat, which is the coronavirus? Who would have thought about that? So speaking about NATO, as you know, our alliance was created to deal with crises, and NATO has been dealing with many crises over 71 years. So we are also playing our part in responding to this one. Last year, when we commemorated the 70th anniversary of NATO, one of the key points that we were stressing when we were talking to our stakeholders was the fact that NATO, the alliance, has kept our countries and our people safe by continuously adapting to the new security challenges. And as the world changes, NATO has been changing with it. And this is also the case today as we deal with the COVID-19. The COVID-19 is an unprecedented challenge for our nations and is having a really profound impact on our people, on all of us, on our way of life, and also on our economies. So I want to share with you what NATO is doing. NATO has adapted again to continue to deal with what is its core function, its core business, which is to provide security to almost 1 billion citizens. And at the same time, NATO has adapted to respond to this new crisis, promoting especially what NATO is all about, which is solidarity. And this crisis has demonstrated that the key role that our military have been playing in support of the national civilian efforts from the beginning, and even if NATO is not a first responder, because you may wonder about this, it has been able to use its strong coordination mechanisms to help allies, to allow allies to help each other to save lives. NATO has coordinated, facilitated the airlift of crucial medical supplies and equipment to help get the right support to the right places at the right time. And it has also contributed to delivering innovative responses. In my view, this crisis shows that it is vital to continue to invest on security and on defense. And I want to tell you why. Security challenges have not disappeared because of COVID-19. On the contrary, we see that potential adversaries will look to exploit the current situation. Terrorist groups could be emboldened. We have seen, for example, ISIS is trying to gain territory in Iraq and in Syria, and we continue to see an assertive Russia. Russia has not reduced its military presence close to our borders, and the same goes with the Russian military presence in Ukraine, in Syria, and in Libya. We see that cyber attacks are ongoing, and also disinformation is spreading. I will say more about disinformation in a minute. So the global balance of power is shifting. We see the rise of China, very, very important. China continues to modernize its armed forces, and China has the second biggest budget, defense budget in the world. So overall, we see a more unpredictable world. And we don't have the luxury of choosing between a health crisis and security threats. So we need to address both at the same time, as very often our Secretary General says. Therefore, in order to prepare for the next crisis, we need to continue to invest on our security and our defense. This is very important. And also, spending on defense can be a powerful engine for economic recovery. As we deal with the economic consequences of this crisis, and there will be a high economic price to pay, the security, for example, in the defense sector, can also play an important role to stimulate economic recovery in our nations, including with investment in critical infrastructure, cyber defense, logistics, and also military mobility. I was saying at the beginning that we see a number of actors exploiting this crisis to weaken us, to weaken our democratic institutions and the response of the West to this crisis. And this takes me to how we are dealing with the challenge of disinformation, especially because this crisis has led to a proliferation of disinformation. So in NATO, we are actively monitoring disinformation, propaganda campaigns by both state and non-state actors. And these campaigns are trying to divide, they are trying to undermine our democracies and our ability also to act. These campaigns claim that the West is weak, and we are countering false narratives with facts, with our values, with our actions, and our actions demonstrate that NATO is ready and is a solidarity organization. We are also coordinating constantly with allies, with our member states. We are sharing information and insight on what we see on this information. And we also publicly rebut false claims with debunk the main disinformation narratives about NATO. And by engaging with the media, with opinion makers, with representatives of the civil society, including through engagements like the one we are having today. That's very important that we join forces. We are also working more closely than we were doing before with the European Union to try to identify, to monitor, and expose disinformation. So what we see is that most of the disinformation is not aimed at NATO as such. The main focus of hostile narratives targeting NATO is to try to erode the trust in our forces, in our troops. For example, in April, there was a fake letter that was sent on behalf of our Secretary General to the Lithuanian Defense Minister. That was fake. And the letter was claiming that the Secretary General was announcing that NATO will be withdrawing its troops from Lithuania. So we assess that this letter was part of a long-standing disinformation operation. But we have also seen fake stories about COVID-19 in NATO's battle group in Latvia and also about US forces in Poland. So what is key for us is that we identify, we monitor, and we also expose hostile narratives that are aimed at us, and that we work closely together. And you, the friends of IATA, Netherlands, can also play an important role, helping our societies be more resilient so that people understand what is fake, what is true, and exposing disinformation. So we are on this all together, and together we will be stronger also in deterring disinformation. So Hugo, over to you. I have spoken enough, so now I'm very happy to take questions from our audience.
Yeah. You addressed a lot of topics. Thank you for that. I'll try to latch on to as many as I can. Let me maybe start with one question that relates to what you just ended with. Is you spoke about external threats, threats of disinformation and other forms of maybe propaganda that are intent on harming the alliance. How do you view internal threats from politicians and parliamentarians, or maybe high-profile government leaders, which also seem to spread misinformation or disinformation themselves from within the alliance? How do you see this problem, and is there also a place for NATO to work in solving this problem?
I, of course, can only speak on behalf of NATO, as you can imagine, but what I can tell you is that when we see the representatives of our nations, and NATO includes 13 nations, when we see the ambassadors that represent the different governments, when we see our defense ministers, our foreign ministers, they all agree that we have to stand together and looking at what the disinformation trends are, look how we can exchange and look at what we see in the information space. And they all agree that the best, the strongest weapon to deal with disinformation and to respond to disinformation is with proactive, factual, evidence-based communications that tell our story of what we are doing. So in this case, speaking on behalf of NATO, it's about how are we responding to this crisis? How are we helping allies help each other? And at the same time, how can we do everything to prevent a conflict and to continue to protect 1 billion citizens in our NATO ally countries? So therefore, it's by standing together, and it's by joining forces, it's by also exposing and helping young people, different sectors of the public society. You were speaking about parliamentarians, so it's talking to each other, it's comparing notes, and it's about having others, like for example you young people, looking at being stronger about what is fake, identifying this is fake, this is not fake, and also spreading that. So it's really a whole civil society effort.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And you touched upon cooperating and coming together, comparing notes on maybe on a national, but also on a NATO-wide platform. In that sense, COVID-19 is maybe the opposite of what you have been hoping for, in that a lot of countries have reacted very differently from each other. If you, for example, compare the Italian response to the Dutch response, which then you in turn compare to the American response, those are very different responses that maybe put more tension on what some have called an already fragile relationship. So how do you, I understand that you're trying to foster cooperation, but how do you create this cooperation? How do you practically make it happen?
So the strength in NATO in this crisis has been to create a platform to coordinate the overall efforts. So for example, nations were coming to us, nations that were really in need, that were facing a very difficult situation at the beginning of the crisis, saying we need help. And then putting this, in a coordination platform, and then having nations coming with offers. So we have created the mechanisms to help each other. And that has been very important. Also because our citizens have seen what is it that we can do to contribute to saving lives. So it has been, the focus has been on helping each other, on showing what NATO is all about, which is really solidarity. And that has been working. I also would like to praise the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a country that, for example, has helped my country, Spain, when Spain came, with the request for help at the beginning, and Italy as well. So a number of countries were in a position to identify, we have allies that are really in need, that are facing a very difficult situation, so let's see what we can do to help each other. And that has involved and has, basically we have put together a very, very, very strong coordination mechanism, and it has worked, and we have seen that allies have responded, and of course every ally has dealt with their national situations in a different way. That has to be respected, and but within respecting that, it's important that you also create the ways to allow for solidarity, because we are the main thing and the main purpose of NATO in this crisis has been to prevent a health crisis from becoming a security crisis.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Then I maybe want to change the topic slightly. Something you also addressed previously is how there is a role for individuals, such as ourselves, listening to you right now, to try to differentiate between fake news and actual news, and only share that which we believe to be true, to be actual news. So there you address the individual. Do you maybe also see a role for large social media companies and the likes to assist on a more global or larger scale than that of the individual, to maybe help in tackling disinformation campaigns? And is there maybe also a role there for NATO, as disinformation touches on the security of us all?
Thank you very much for that question. It's a very important question. The European Union is working very, very closely with companies, with the private sector. So NATO is not working as closely as the European Union with the private sector, but we also have a role to play. We are also in constant relations and partnership with the private companies. We are talking to them. When, for example, we face disinformation campaigns on our accounts, on Twitter, on Facebook, we get in touch with them, they help us. So it's very important that there is also a dialogue in terms of regulation and how private companies can help deal with this information. NATO is not in the lead, it is mainly the European Union, but constant dialogue with these companies is very important. What we do as NATO is on a case basis, so when we have an issue, they help us. So far, we have seen that we have received a positive feedback, and companies are helping us. But of course, this is broader because it's about regulating how the private sector can help us in dealing with this information. But then coming back to the individual, what you said at the beginning is very, very important. And talking to each other, for example, the fact that we are having this discussion and that young people, but also, other generations, that we need to increase the awareness about this information, because sometimes you just look at the headline. We don't have much time to read a lot. So it's about the first key messages that you get. And it's very important that we think twice. Is this fake? Is this not? And then that also we share what we see, because by doing that, we will be stronger and we will increase the knowledge of people about being careful and being vigilant.
Okay, thank you. So there we look to ourselves as being the subject or the target of a disinformation campaign. But if we change the lens, how does NATO maybe participate in, well, I don't know if you would like to call them disinformation campaigns, but I'm sure that you're familiar with the Gerasimov doctrine, which is actually a Russian general analyzing the Western way of operating in the world, where he claims or he states that we ourselves use information through the entire spectrum. What do you think of NATO's role in actively contributing to such kinds of campaigns?
Well, NATO is not conducting disinformation or propaganda campaigns, and we are really convinced that we are an alliance of democracies. Our values is very important. Credibility and transparency is at the core of everything we do, and I know transparency is very important in the Netherlands. So, and it's about our credibility as communicators. So I cannot lie, but there are sources of disinformation and propaganda. They lie. They don't have to follow any rules. We have to abide by the rules, and that's very important. And sometimes we will be slower in communicating, but what we will be communicating will be true, will be fact-based, will be based on the evidence, it will be based on what our politicians and our nations have decided. So there is a huge difference. But what is very important is to have the capability to analyze this information, because by analyzing this information, we see what the trends are, and we can also adjust our communications. And this is what we do constantly in the Public Diplomacy Division. Sometimes we don't push back on certain instances of disinformation because you give more relevance to this information, but when we really see that our values are targeted, then we push back, and that's the right that we have, but we have to do this in a credible way. And for us, credible communications is key.
Okay, thank you. And then if you, so we've talked about how NATO itself cooperates and works on these topics. There is also a group of countries that are partner countries of NATO. How are they part of this dynamic, or are they at all?
Absolutely. That's also very important. We work very, very closely with many partners. And for example, I can mention to you Ukraine, I can mention to you Georgia, I can mention Moldova. We are working very closely with them to help them be more resilient, to help them with credible communications. I was referring to that in the past, and we have been working very, very closely with the Georgian civil society, with the Georgian authorities, with the Ukrainian government, environment, with the Ukrainian civil society, to not to teach, because it's not about teaching, but it's about sharing with them the tools that we use to have transparent, fact-based and credible communication. So it's we are also sharing what we see in the disinformation environment, what we see in the information space, and this is a very close cooperation. Each nation will do this in a different way, but it's important that we work together. So our partnership with countries that are very close to us, it's very important, and it's something that our public diplomacy division has been investing on for a long time, for many years. And actually, we are also working very closely with the European Union to help partner countries being more reliable in terms of public communications, in terms of strategic communications. So this is also a joint effort, and we see that there is progress. We see that both Georgia and Ukraine have very developed now strategic communications capabilities, and they are doing much better. And I think that also it is also thanks to the working relationship that we have had for many years. And we are also learning from them, by the way. It's a two-way street.
Yeah,
because they are more exposed to certain kinds of disinformation than we are.
Yeah. And so in this cooperation, you work together to counter direct threats that are on the ground noticeable right at that moment, I can imagine. Do you also maybe see developments in the future regarding disinformation and perhaps even regarding international human rights, where there is opportunity or a call for a formation of international norms with regards to the spread of information? Like on the extent that we also have other kinds of human rights norms in the international society. Well,
as I was saying, we are democratic societies, and we have to abide by our values. So therefore, it's very important that we take into account the human rights aspect of everything we do, and so that's something that, of course, will be guiding our work. In terms of regulation, again, NATO is not an organization that is in the lead about what the normative regulations are, but we are. I mean, that's at the core of what we do.
And then maybe outside of NATO, although that might be a difficult question for you to answer, but do you, globally speaking, do you see any potential for the development of a norm or an agreement, or perhaps not with all the countries in the world, but with a group of countries that we agree together that we will refrain from using disinformation?
That would be great.
As much as possible.
That would be great. What I can tell you is that what we are seeing is really unprecedented. And the unprecedented challenges that we are facing may also lead to new norms that help us deal with this, with many of the new challenges that we face. Even if disinformation is not a new phenomenon, it's a very old one, but it's technology, the use of technology that is changing the nature of disinformation, how fast it goes, the speed of it. So, for example, now in dealing with disinformation at NATO as such, we are talking to the United Nations, and we are about now to respond also to the request for support in response to COVID-19 to UN OCHA. So I'm now in contact with the lead communicators from the United Nations. We are doing the same with the European Union, with other institutions. So maybe this is something that we can put on the table. I think it will be very difficult to achieve that, and we have to be realistic, because we speak about non-state but also state actors promulgating this information. So therefore, it will be very, very difficult, because it's a weapon. Information is a weapon, and it's being used. We have seen that to divide, to weaken us, to create confusion, and so I don't see that happening. But these are unprecedented times, and so we have to push boundaries. So, but it's very unlikely to happen. It could happen maybe in the context of European Union, but we are not promoting disinformation. We are institutions that we are defending our values, and we are against disinformation. We are looking at everything we can do to have, as I said, transparent communications, which is the most effective tool to counter disinformation again.
Yeah. So if I then understand you correctly, you expect that the use of disinformation will continue, perhaps just as fiercely as it is now, after the pandemic or in any new kind of situation?
Absolutely. It will become worse because of technology, because technology is giving so many advantages to the ones who are using this information as a weapon. So therefore, we can only expect that this will become even more confusing, more complicated, because, technology has no borders. So, and the speed of development of technology is so advanced. So this will continue and it will become even worse. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid.
That you expect it to be true. Okay. And then you also address the EU already, and that you closely cooperate with them. If you could give any advice or could have any public requests on this cooperation, what would you like to improve in this working together with the European Union?
We are working together to improve everything we have done until now. So we have a very long-standing cooperation with the European Union in many areas, but also in the area of public communications and strategic communications. So we are working mainly in two areas. One is to compare notes on how we understand this information. So are we on the same page in terms of what we see, in terms of trends, what is aimed at the European Union, EU nations, NATO as such, and then also on the engaging function, which is there anything that we can communicate together? Keeping in mind that we are different organizations, there are many sensitivities, but if you see one of the targets of disinformation is the West, and the fact that the West and multilateral organizations such as the European Union and NATO are not responding in an effective way to this crisis, when our citizens see that we are also contributing to responding and to providing solutions to the current crisis. So therefore, what I would advise is that we continue to do what we are doing, which is looking at ways to communicating together when our values are targeted as such, and also what more we can do to understand better. Since this is going so fast. So we are already working a lot. For example, we contribute to the disinformation reports that the European Union publishes. They are also sharing with us. So compared to, I would say, a year ago, is much more, but there is still much more to do.
Okay. Clear, thank you. I take a brief look at the time. Do you maybe have time for one more question before we wrap things up? Okay, so the NATO is now 71 years old, which is, I guess, a small party to celebrate. How do you view the distant and maybe less distant or distant and nearby future for NATO? What kind of developments do you realistically expect to see on the subject of disinformation, obviously?
On disinformation and overall, I see hybrid threats. So it's about unconventional threats. That's what we will be facing. That's what we see already. For example, COVID-19 is an invisible threat. It's a hybrid threat. We don't see it, but it's affecting us all. So what is going to happen in the future is about hybrid, is about unconventional, is going to be about cyber. So therefore, we will have to also, as institutions, governments, civil society, we will have to be better prepared to deal with these new hybrid threats, because that's where this is where it's going to make very difficult for us to react and to be fast, to have all the tools at our disposal. So this is a challenge for all of us, but now this is how things are. They are not conventional anymore. They are more unconventional than conventional.
Okay, thank you. Then I think we've had a nice discussion, a very broad discussion, but a very interesting one at that. We've touched upon all kinds of topics. Is there maybe one thing that you would like to end with for our viewers?
Well, first, I would like to thank you for being interested in security, in the debate about the challenges that we face, and to see young people also playing a role in this. I know that these are difficult times for all of us. I know that it's difficult to have a job. If you have a job, you can lose the job because of the current situation. So just to say something about, also employment opportunities in NATO. We have launched a very ambitious young professionals program, and you have to be over 21 to apply. The deadline is the 31st of May. I can tell you that NATO is a very interesting organization to work in. We are a small organization, and you see the pulse of Europe and North America working together. So NATO is really a wonderful organization to work in. I have been here for 15 years, and I have not regretted a single day to be here, and I have enjoyed my job every day. So if you are interested, if you are over 21st, if you have a master's degree, maybe this is an opportunity for you. And I hope that also NATO will contribute to creating more jobs, because I know it's tough times, but we have to take any opportunity. So thank you for being there. Thank you for this interesting conversation.